Hey everybody, it's Eric from EPautos.com, your libertarian car guy. While I'm stuck in a conga line here, I wanted to reflect on something. I'm driving this 2025 Ford Explorer, and wow, time flies. I remember back in the 90s driving the original Explorer, which some of you will remember, and that one was available with a V8. Then there was this whole horrible debacle with the Explorer and the Firestone tires, which was a combination of factors, but chiefly the underlying problem was that you had a mass market SUV, which in the 90s was a phenomenon. It was a new thing. In the past, SUVs were 4x4s, and generally people who drove 4x4s understood what they were, and they drove them with respect to their limitations, particularly at high speed and when subjected to abrupt steering inputs, because they were high off the ground and they typically had truck-type suspensions, so they didn't handle that great. Thing was, Ford had this great idea of making them into essentially what were once upon a time the popular form of American cars, a big sort of sedan, except it was in the shape of a 4x4, and hence the SUV. Well, the problem with that was that you had a lot of people who bought these things and had no idea that they handled differently than your typical car. And then the problem was compounded by running on low air pressure tires and at high speed. So you had heat and friction building up in these tires. Then the tires blew, and there was some talk about, subsequently after the debacle, that the tires were marginal. And yeah, but the real problem was that they tended to be run at high speed, underinflated. They got hot, they blew, and when they blew, the weight shifted suddenly, and that in a vehicle like a jacked up old style 4x4 could result in barrel rolling and all sorts of other awful problems. Anyway, that's not so much what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to reminisce with you about the fact that SUVs like this, mid-sized SUVs, used to come standard with V6s, and they generally offered V8s, the early Explorer being a prime example of that. And now this Explorer comes standard with a 4-cylinder engine, and the biggest engine you can get is a 6. Now the 6, a 3-liter 6, does make a whole lot more power than the much larger 4.6, I think it was, V8s that were available in the first generation Explorers. But again, it begs the question of why are they putting these little engines in these big, heavy vehicles? And of course, as I've explained in some of my articles up at EPautos, it has to do with compliance. It has to do particularly with regard to federal emissions regulations pertaining to carbon dioxide. That's a gas that you can't clean up, to use the vernacular. Not that it's dirty, because it has nothing to do with air pollution, but nonetheless, gas in, gas out. Air and fuel, you burn it, you're going to get a certain quantity of carbon dioxide. Now, if an engine is large, like a V8, large displacement, let's say a 4.6 liter V8, it has more cylinder volume, it's going to move more air, even when it's under light load, than a much smaller engine will. So that is the chief reason, because smaller engine, less gas, meaning CO2, coming out of the tailpipe. Now, of course, all else being equal, that smaller engine, a 3-liter 6 without a turbo on it or two, isn't going to make anywhere near the power of a V8. And that's why they put the turbo on, because on the one hand, they need to comply, and on the other, they need to appeal to people who are free to not buy their products, and wouldn't if they came with completely ridiculously, inappropriately small, underpowered engines. So they put the turbo on it. Turbo wicks up the power, and has a side benefit, by the way, of increasing low-end torque. That's a kind of little freebie that you get if you don't count the extra cost of the turbo and all the peripheral gear. And they're very nice driving. I don't have any complaints. I think it's really a marvelous example of what engineers can do to deal with the government and deal with these problems. But at the end of the day, I have to wonder whether a vehicle like this Explorer would just be a better vehicle overall, and certainly a less expensive vehicle, if it had a mildly tuned 300 horsepower V8 under the hood, rather than a heavily pressurized turbocharged 3-liter 6. Curious to get your feedback on that, and more over at EPautos.com. Thanks as always for listening, and we'll be back in a bit.